Good evening. Welcome to New Symposium, Civil Discourse in the Pursuit of Truth.
It's great to see you all here. This is the second of two symposiums that we conceived of late last year talking about Wichita. The first one, focusing on kind of the built environment, took place in February, and we easily had twice as many people here. So either April's harder, or the weather is scaring people off, or people look at the title of the top of the symposium and they think, culture, what's that? Let's go argue about buildings instead. But I'm sure that we're going to have a good conversation here tonight anyway. Let me lay out basically how this is going to work. The panelists are from my left to my right, Renee Duxler, Andrea Knighton, Phil Nelson, Matt Riddle. They're going to speak in that order. All of them have prepared presentations. A couple of them have some slides that they want to show as part of their presentations. And these presentations will be around 9 minutes in length, okay? We're going to hold them to that because we want to move things along. We want to make sure that there'll be time for questions and conversation at the end. I will be keeping time, and I will give you all signals as you get closer. And you can trust me in terms of my timekeeping because I have the finest timekeeper that has yet been invented to help me keep track of these sorts of things. At the conclusion of each person's presentation, I am going to ask you one question, and that's a question that I will develop while listening to your presentation. And the goal of that question will be to maybe sharpen or refine or push a little bit further along one or another elements of what I have just heard you say. And then we'll go on to the next person. When everyone is concluded, we'll open it up to conversation with the audience. I strongly encourage people in the audience to have questions, not statements. Someone might feel that they have to make a statement in order to ask the question. If that is the case, move very expeditiously through your statement so that you can get to the question. And preferably the question could be directed to one or another member of the panel, or you could direct it to all of them. I will intrude on those questions and direct them and ask for people to respond or build upon some of the things discussed in response to the questions as I feel appropriate. I mean, I'm the moderator. I've got that kind of authority. So, okay. If there's no other questions, let's begin our discussion about the quality of life in this city that we call home. Our first speaker is Renee Duxler. Renee is a social worker and a community advocate. She has worked for the KU School of Medicine, for Rainbows United, Positive Directions, the Alzheimer's Association, and she has served as an adjunct faculty instructor at both Newman and WSU. She's an independent business owner, and she now serves as the executive director for the Douglas Design District, as well as the Next Step project coordinator for Dress for Access. And she wanted to make sure that we also mention that she is the mother of 3 very, very, very active children. So let's welcome Renee Duxler.
Thank you so much. I super appreciate being included in this conversation because there are not many things that I enjoy talking about more than quality of place here in Wichita. I love my home here. I take great pride in being a part of it and contributing, hopefully in positive ways, to the community. I also am actually very thankful. This is kind of a more intimate setting tonight because that's how I do best in talking in more intimate settings. And so I am going to try not to ramble and kind of move all over the place, but that's kind of how I present and speak, and so please bear with me. As Dr. Fox mentioned, I am currently the executive director of the Douglas Design District. Had been a business owner in the district and a board member for many years, and they just hired me this last January as the full-time executive director. And the Douglas Design District, if you're not aware of what it is essentially a commercial district, a district we've created among businesses from Washington to essentially Oliver, all along Douglas Avenue, and then up to 2nd Street and down to Kellogg. And it includes a lot of business as well as residential and green spaces, churches, nonprofits, very much an eclectic and vibrant neighborhood, as we like to see it. So the mission of the Douglas Design District has been to always create a vibrant commercial district for our businesses to thrive. But peripherally, that includes so much more, as we know when we talk about businesses and economic development and thriving, that there's the marketing and kind of promotion of the district and helping, push people to be aware of our businesses. But we're also concerned with beautification and cleanliness, ensuring that it's a place that people want to be and spend time. Safety, both perceived as well as real safety while being in the district. Jobs creation, making our businesses thrive to create jobs. Convenient access to goods and services. Again, as having a lot of residential areas in the district, we want our residents to be able to have access to local goods and services easily. The community engagement and ownership, having people take pride in their neighborhood and where they live. Access to multimodal transportation, so not only the automobile traffic that Wichita loves, but also ensuring that public transportation is successful, as well as bikeability and walkability in the district. And then finally, just kind of not only creating the economic opportunity and development, but also all of these things benefit and improve physical and mental health outcomes. And so kind of the circular sort of product of what we're doing. And we know that every dollar spent at a local business guarantees 27% more local economic wealth than if spent at a chain store or restaurant. And so there really is this push for us within the district, not only to help businesses thrive, but to help local businesses thrive so that our local economy continues to grow and be supportive. We are a completely voluntary nonprofit organization, and so we have voluntary membership. Our businesses pay and invest in the district on a voluntary basis, and then we also receive some grants and outside sponsorships and investments throughout the community. And this is important to me to kind of discuss and talk about, because we don't receive government money, and we've never received government money for what we're doing in the Douglas Design District. This has been a completely kind of private project entity. So that's kind of what I'm kind of doing now in the Douglas Design District. I am having a lot of fun with it. It's a lot of fun to talk about public art and bikeability, and I did include this picture because this is from Open Streets last year, and it kind of just gives this really nice visual of what we're looking to do in the Douglas Design District. But I do have to kind of pivot just a second, because as Dr. Fox also mentioned, I have been a social worker in this community for over 15 years now. And so while I am enjoying having the fun conversations, these kind of higher conversations about culture and infrastructure and public art and what we can do to kind of be cool and hip and trendy, I'm also very aware of the not so fun conversations that I feel we have to have when we're talking about quality of place. And so when we talk about Wichita, it's so important to me that we don't gloss over the fact that we have a pretty high crime rate, actually the highest for the state of Kansas, including both Topeka and Wyandotte County. Our violent crime, specifically our homicide rate, continues to climb year over year here in Wichita. Child abuse and neglect is an issue that's near and dear to my heart. We just lost another child 2 weeks ago. And we can point fingers, DCF, state, whatever, but this is our community. We should not be losing children here. Sexual assault continues to rise, as well as domestic violence. We, again, have more PFAs, protection from abuse orders, here in Wichita than any other part of the state. So those are the not fun conversations that I feel very strongly we have to have parallel to the conversations that we're having about culture and quality of life. I kind of think of it a little bit of like Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and there are many of us who are kind of up in the love and connection and esteem part, and we're trying to build that in our community, but we need to make sure that there are people in our community that are getting the physiological needs and the safety needs taken care of. And we talk a lot about being pro-business and economic development and what we're going to do here. And I fundamentally believe there is nothing more pro-business than investing in human capital and investing in people. And so it's my kind of opinion that when we're talking about the investments of city and county and kind of local government, that's really the foundation, that we have to be giving permission and allowing our local government to cover, public health, to cover police safety and protection, to cover social infrastructure like the pools and the libraries and even, the street structures, in order for people to be able to thrive. Because there is nothing, to me, again, that's more pro-business than helping people, you're only as strong as your weakest link sort of situation. Helping people thrive and grow and get their, most basic needs met in order to, if I can't catch you on the kind of moral imperative of it and on the heart here, like this is why we need to do this, because you're creating taxpayers, you're creating property owners, you're creating consumers in this process. And I think that it's just a domino effect then. And so I'm happy to allow the city to engage in those, kind of very basic foundational needs, so that hopefully our economy grows, people are able to invest, and then we get to a situation where we have the private partnerships and private-public partnerships that can kind of do this higher level cultural esteem connection sort of stuff. I think when it was the last time Chung was here, he kind of talked about Wichita's chronic underinvestment in ourselves, and specifically both charitable and community and philanthropic investment, but everything from civic to downtown residential and commercial to mega projects. We are just not investing in ourselves the way that many of our sister kind of Midwest cities are. And I would love to continue to have that conversation, and that's actually a question that I punt back out to people, because I'm not sure why that is. I don't know why we necessarily do that. I think some of it is because we aren't investing kind of in that basic level, and so our little hierarchy is kind of topsy-turvy, and people aren't capable of investing like we need them to. But I think there's a lot of dynamics that go along with that, and so I definitely punt that question back out to people as to why we're not investing. But my hope is to continue to have the parallel conversations about the fun things and about the not so fun things that make our quality of place better here in Wichita.
Thank you. Renee, I'd like to ask you a two-part question. Sure. You talked about pride in neighborhood and how important it is for that kind of feeling. There's been some conversations about pride in Wichita, particularly over the last few years. And there are people that have articulated a couple of concerns about that pride, and I'd like to bring those up to you and maybe connect them to some other points that you've made. First of all, is that kind of feeling, in your view, something that is solely organic, something that solely originates out of just the ordinary actions of people, looking around and assessing their lives? Or are there things that can be done, whether by businesses or by government agencies, to actually encourage pride? In other words, can pride be created? Second part to that, you talked about investment in the community. Well, a lot of the work that is involved in encouraging and maintaining investment is decidedly uncool and unhip. Investment is often a dull and long process. Is the concern for generating pride, if it is in fact something that can be generated, would that maybe be a distraction from doing the kind of work that investment requires? In other words, are maybe people too busy making decals of the flag to really be thinking about, this is what we need to be doing for making our parks more sustainable?
Right. No, totally fair question. So to the first point, I don't think that pride is an organic thing, and I think that when you look at the history of Wichita and kind of where we've come, kind of is indicative of that. But I know just from my own personal experience, and speaking from my personal experience to it, what I've seen, especially when it comes to public art and a lot of the public murals that are going up and some of the things that we've done as far as Avenue Art Days in the Design District, that when neighbors and residents and community is sort of urged to get out and be a part of creating their space, so they have a say in the art that's going up or the flowers that are being planted, or in taking care of a community green space or garden or street. When they have that say and that responsibility and are given that's kind of handed to them, they very willingly kind of take that on and then take great pride in being able to say, this is where I live, and I was a part of creating whatever it is that's been created. So that's just one example of ways that I think people can have pride in their neighborhoods is by taking ownership of it, and being able to be a part of creating what it is about their community or their neighborhood that makes it special. There is, a lot of kind of balance between getting people to kind of, on a very shallow level, take pride by being able to put a flag up or put a decal up, or say very easily, I love Wichita, and then not go any deeper that in terms of volunteer investment or money investment or whatever they kind of need to do, the work that really truly needs to be done to make a community better. And so, again, working in nonprofit my whole adult life, that's always the struggle, is how do we make doing this work be kind of sexy and fun? Like, how do we make this, and it does sometimes become a distraction. So finding that kind of sweet spot of incentivizing and invoking people to do the work that needs to be done, but also recognizing that humans are humans, and a lot of times they want to get something else out of it, or they want to be able to, post it on social media or whatever it is that's going to kind of, offer that motivation. I so wish that everybody was capable of kind of putting in the work or putting in the money or putting in the investment just out of the goodness of their hearts. But the reality is that's usually not the case for everybody, and we just have to be mindful of that. So I don't know that I'm necessarily answering the question, but I do know that it's constantly a struggle to get beyond kind of conversations about pride and move into what are we actually doing to make our community a better place.
Okay. I appreciate that perspective. We're going to move on now to our second presenter, Andrea Knighton. I have known Andrea Knighton for quite a few years, and for most of those years I have continually referred to her as Heidi. I have no idea why I do this. I assume that as a child I was perhaps greatly blessed or greatly traumatized by somebody named Heidi Knighton, and it's buried somewhere in my head. And so it just comes out again and again and again. I have actually gone up to her mother, who's right here, wonderful lady, Billy Knighton, and asked her about her daughter Heidi. And it's just, anyway. Similar to Renee, Andrea's background is in social work. She graduated from Wichita State with a master's degree in social work in 2012. And her research area and the work that she subsequently did involved dealing with issues of psychological trauma. As she examined this issue and began to connect it with forms of education that can take place in the schools and other contexts, she became more and more interested in the way in which these questions of trauma really connect with larger issues about the community, the environment, and the world in which we live in. And this led her to develop very holistic approaches to her preferred topic, and ultimately led her to take the step to organize the Wichita Area Sustainability Initiative. And the work that she's done with that is very impressive. And I'm looking forward to what she has to share with us today. So everyone, Andrea Knighton. What's that?
Just a little bit of light on the stage.
Well, but she also has a thing. When the slides are all done, we'll turn the light back on.
Well, it's a real privilege to be here, and my response to the topic today has been completely scripted, but hopefully very conversationally, and I have a lot to cover in 9 minutes, I promise. So here we go. All right. As mentioned, my name's Andrea, not Heidi, Andrea Knighton. I became an ecological social worker when I founded Wichita Area Sustainability Initiative, called WASI for short, when I graduated from WSU with a master's in social work in 2012. And WASI's mission is to help build basic resource security in our area with sustainable and people-powered solutions. Ecological social work, and therefore WASI, is informed by the science of ecology and by social work, which is a behavioral science that got its start over a century ago. And social work is somewhat of a fusion between sociology and psychology, and is distinguished by its person and environment framework. For this framework, picture you at the center and the many social layers that surround you. When you add one more layer, the biosphere, this creates an area of study that is being pursued by ecological social work scholars around the world. This ecology-driven realignment helps to illuminate promising strategies for building a much more sustainable and therefore abundant world. These strategies will be used to help create a response to the new symposium's topic today, Wichita Matters, Our Quality of Life. But first, there is one more concept that needs to be shared, and that is, today, there are two worldviews in contemporary science that are in competition with one another.
Do I go to the second slide now?
No, it'll be in just a bit.
Okay.
Due to discoveries in the early 20th century that brought a clearer understanding of the inner workings of our universe, with both worldviews have the power to shape our world. Using the work of physicist and educator Fritjof Capra, let me explain. The still present 17th century world as a machine mechanistic worldview sees our world as composed of isolated building blocks. It taught us to understand complex systems by reducing them to the smallest constituent parts. It points us towards using our planet as an extractive resource and encourages the values of domination, competition, quantity, and expansion. In contrast, the 20th century brought us the world as a network ecological worldview. It's understanding that the properties of life emerge only from a complex web of inseparable relationships. It encourages us to understand our natural world and to see that it provides the answers for sustainability and elicits the values of empowerment, cooperation, quality, and conservation. This ecological worldview began to emerge in the early 1900s through advances in biology and psychology, the new science of ecology, and the dramatic discoveries in quantum physics. Now we can go to the next slide.
Okay.
The ecological worldview is shaped by the patterns and processes used by nature to sustain all life, also referred to as ecological principles or the language of nature. To illuminate how ecological principles can be applied to literally shape a different world, I will proceed with doing a side-by-side comparison with today's mechanistically shaped world. So here we go. Ecology prioritized before economy versus economy placed above ecology. An emerging third industrial revolution shared economy with distributed resources versus the second industrial revolution with the market economy and siloed resources. Economic localization versus economic globalization. Zero waste manufacturing versus conventional manufacturing. Sustainable agriculture and agroecology repeated worldwide, a strategy that can feed the world and help restore the environment as well as local economies versus industrialized agriculture. Locally owned enterprises versus non-resident corporate-owned enterprises. Human-driven culture and expression versus corporate-driven monoculture. A worldview working to implement life-giving sustainable alternatives versus global growth-oriented economics on track to demand 2.5 Earths by 2050. We'll stop there due to time, but I think you get the picture. This comparison highlights how sustainable strategies, when applied, do have the power to positively impact the quality of life, including here in Wichita. We'll refer back to this, but let's answer some form questions specifically. Number one, does Wichita offer sufficient spaces, places, and activities to satisfy diversity? Because sustainable living is rooted in a deep knowledge of place, I'm going to tackle question number one as follows. I'd say in general, yes, for its size, Wichita is doing a good job of offering spaces and activity that satisfy diversity. I also see room for growth. But I'd like to make some suggestions here, but I'd like to point out some strengths first. I believe one of Wichita's primary strengths is we have an energetic spirit about us that continues to be shaped by a number of factors. We live within a bioregion that offers wide open spaces and skies, extremes in weather, and a geographic location that intertwine entrepreneurialism with our founding. Regional historian Dr. Craig Miner captured this well in his book, The History of the Sunflower State. He says Kansas, and I'll say Wichita too, is a land of extremes. You see it in our weather, our politics, and our history. From cowboys and drovers given the freedom of the city in Delano in the 1870s to Carrie Nation, smashing up the Eaton Hotel bar at the other end of Douglas in 1900. And during the same era, at the north end of town, we were literally manufacturing our own planes, trains, and automobiles out of the Burton Car Works factory, their 37th and Broadway. So much life going on. So to paraphrase Dr. Miner again, a common serious thread is Kansans are idealists, progressive, and pragmatic. Practical idealists, as William Allen White put it. They try to achieve what other people only discuss in the abstract. I see this trying to achieve what other people only discuss. It's that energetic spirit. And we need to find more innovative ways to invest in it. And economic localization is a key strategy for doing this. I'll use this as my answer for question number 4 as well. Are our separations, even cross purposes, natural or the result of ignoring one another? I'd say a bit of yes to all the above because we're so busy doing. I'd like to end with answering question number 2. Culturally speaking, what projects and identities have helped or could help us feel more connected and trusting of one another? I'd say that if we do not address a particular area of weakness, we are missing a key opportunity to boost our connections and trust for one another. Here it is. In Wichita, We have 44 square miles of food deserts where healthy foods such as fruits and vegetables are not easily accessible for more than 1/4 of Wichita's population. And in Sedgwick County, we have 1 in 5 children that are food insecure. And research shows that adversity and poor health in childhood can lead to a long list of chronic health problems in adulthood. So our kids and future adults are in harm's way. But if we were to create a serious, sustainable urban agriculture response to make nutrient-dense, healthy food available, one, in the 2 very different worlds we just compared, each of the sustainable strategies would be implemented. 2, if today's local food production of just 1% was taken to 25%, we could create approximately 27,000 jobs. And 3, think what this could do for our culture, our culinary arts, our health outcomes, and connections and trust for one another. If our community were to implement this level of care and innovation for one another, this for me would show that our quality of life here really does matter. And I believe our energetic spirit can get us there because that is what practical idealists do. Thank you.
Andrea, I really enjoyed how you managed to take such a large set of ideas and bring them down to some very practical questions. If you don't mind, I'd like to run back up the ladder just a little bit, okay. just for a moment. The way that you talked about Wichita's particular bioregion, about that's something that connects with a lot of conversations that I've had. Wichita is obviously not a small town. It is a significant urban center, and yet at the same time, there's always been this sense that Wichita is not quite metropolitan enough. It's not quite big enough. It's missing something. Your comment seems to suggest that a place like Wichita might occupy kind of a sweet spot in the sense that it can still see in the larger sense the alternative approach that these worldviews make available, but it also has within itself the resources to act on them in a practical way. Do you understand what I'm saying? And if so, do you see some sense in that, or am I misunderstanding your larger point?
No, I think there's a reason why we are the largest industrialized city in Kansas. And I do really believe in that entrepreneurial spirit. And I think that, and even our wide open spaces, I think we have space to think, we have the room to think and to contemplate, and we produce, we're producers. And I really think that with that entrepreneurial spirit, and I also think that having the space to think and to contemplate, and we have this third industrial revolution that really is just waiting in the wings. And, was thinking about the drovers that were going up and down Douglas, and then I think 100 years later, it was my generation, the baby boomers, we were dragging Douglas. Okay, so in 50 years in, we're beautifying Douglas. So I think that's probably going the right direction. But one thing that we have now is that we're literally walking around with computers in our hands. And this world as a network is about our connections to one another. And it is about, if you're starting to see it, you don't call a taxi cab anymore. You can call Lyft or Uber. You don't have to go to a hotel anymore. You can go to an Airbnb. Resources are being distributed. And as soon as our energy regime changes, that's going to be distributed even more. And I think that Wichita can take that and grab that and be ahead of the curve and take care of things. We're all in an economic system that is providing so much pressure on us. One thing that did plateau for the baby boomers, after we were dragging Douglas, but that was 20 years in of a lot of productivity after World War II. But since the 70s, our real wages have plateaued. And our inflation's like this, and the consumer price index is even going higher. So the basics that we need, all living beings on Earth need only 7 things. And that is food, water, shelter, space, sunlight, soil, and air. All living beings on Earth share only those 7. That's survival level. And when you start pushing people down into, it's kind of like Maslow's, hierarchy, but I'm doing it from an ecological standpoint and how we share life with all other living beings. When we start pushing people, you're creating suffering, you're creating misery, you're creating trauma, and I just really think that Wichita has that energetic spirit that's like, no, not here. There are places like Belo Horizonte, Brazil, that ended hunger. I think we can do it. And it's because we're walking around with computers in our hands and we can make those networks, and that energetic entrepreneurial spirit, I think Wichita has it.
Okay, thank you. All right, after looking to a couple of individuals who have studied and thought about society, we're going to move on to an individual who has run societies. Phil Nelson is the grave eminence on this panel today. His first job, his professional career began as transportation land use planner with the Wichita-Sedgwick County Metropolitan Area Planning Department. That's a mouthful. He went on to be the first city administrator of Valley Center, served as the assistant city administrator for the city of Great Bend. In time, he was the city manager of Derby for 13 years. He also worked as the city manager of North Glen, Colorado and Troy, Michigan. He accepted a position as president and CEO of the Columbia Association in Maryland, a nonprofit community service provider, where he worked until his retirement at 2014. What is he doing here? Well, after his retirement, he was offered an interim position as director of the Wichita Area Metropolitan Planning Organization. That interim position has now lasted over 3 years. And it was through a scenario planning, kind of, what would you call it? A meeting, series of meetings. Yes. That was when I first got to know Phil and came to really appreciate his very practical sense of the world we live in. So we're interested in what you have to say about Wichita's quality of life and your ability to compare it to so many other places where you have lived and worked. Ladies and gentlemen, Phil Nelson.
Thank you, and thank you for pointing out my suspect choices in career. I'd like to take a different kind of a track tonight, and my presentation is somewhat scripted today because I wrote most of it today. And at my advanced age, I'm kind of trying to remember all the things that I wrote. One of the things that we've talked about so far is quality of place. And quality of place in this area as well as everywhere has been kind of configured over an extended period of time. And I'd like to talk about change and vision that's going to take us into the next, over the next planning period. Right now, my organization is working on a long-range transportation plan, which is over a 20-year period. And there's going to be so many different changes. We're trying to determine, are we investing in the right types of infrastructure? Are we investing in the right types of different things that we need to face the future? The document we're updating right now is basically a 400-page doorstop. And we need to try to make this more of a humanistic approach as to what are we going to be doing in the next 20 years and how people are going to move in the next 20 years and what is that going to do to quality of life and quality of place. Again, we're about to see some of the most monumental changes that we've gone through since the end of World War II. The definition of change, I came up with this, is very simple: to make or become different. The actual execution is the difficult part. And according to Paul McGinnis, Director of Training and Delivery of the North American Neuro Leadership Group, the old adage, the only constant is change, needs to be updated. Instead, it should read, the only constant is resistance to change. And there are many acronyms that sustain this statement, and you've heard most of them. NIMBY, not in my backyard. CAVE, Citizens Against Virtually Everything. ABCD, Annoyed by Cave Dwellers. And my favorite, BANANA, build absolutely nothing anywhere near anyone, just to mention a few. The simple fact that this change is, and the trends that drive this change are so subtle, they're probably not even noticed by so many people in the region and the state. But trends are one of the several factors that are going to shape this region, and my organization has spent a great deal of time and a great deal of energy monitoring demographic, land use, lifestyle, shopping, and other human-related trends that are going to try to determine what impacts these trends will have on quality of place, and especially in our professional world. If current trends continue, the region could see some of the most substantial changes we've seen in a number of years, and using the current trends, there are limited ways that the region can deal with these changes. The first is to ignore the trends and just basically accept what's going on and react after the fact. A second approach might be to prepare for the change, accept the inevitable, and try to capitalize on the probable extrapolated results. And the third possibility is to commit resources now to try to change the trend, especially if they aren't in the best interest of the region. Perhaps the most significant trend that we're seeing right now that needs to be addressed is stopping the outmigration and providing for the attraction of new talent and keeping the talent that we have, especially in the prime wage earning and spending age categories. The late president of Wichita State University, Dr. John Bardo, noted that the second biggest export in the South Central Kansas region is educated 18 to 54-year-olds. What we're trying to do is follow these trends, develop a kind of a pattern as to how we can address these as we move forward. And I'd like to go over just some of these trends that we're seeing so you can have an idea of how these are going to impact us. The Wichita City and Sedgwick County Comprehensive Plan projects actual population growth over the next 20 years of 0.83%. Actual growth over the last 3 years is 0.39%. And for planning purposes, we split the difference and we're staying at 0.61% will be the annual growth rate. It seems like, that's not quite very many new people coming to the area, and when you project that out over a 20-year period, you're talking about less than 70,000 new people coming to the city. That's about 3,500 new residents per year over this 20-year planning period. Another trend we're seeing is 40% of households in the region are single occupant households. And that trend is anticipated to increase to 50% during the 20-year planning period. The U.S. Census Bureau is saying that over 80% of households, because the millennials are waiting later in life to have children, over 80% of households could be childless by the mid-2030s. Nationwide, over 64 million millennials and younger generations are moving back home due to crushing student debt load and other job-related circumstances. In 2010, this is one that's kind of surprising for this area, 91% of building permits in this region were for single-family houses or for remodeling single-family houses. In 2017, that percentage decreased to 43%. The primary focus was on multifamily construction. And you can see that just in downtown Wichita. There are like 1,500 new dwelling units just in downtown Wichita. Over the next 20 years, if current trends hold, the region could see an over 11% decrease in school-age children, nominal growth in prime wage earners, 20 to 64-year-olds, and an over 50% increase in 65 and older people. The 65-year and older alone will grow from 13% of the population to about 23% of the population. But we're talking a lot about just the money that it takes to generate some of these trends. When you're talking about the state legislature, it's taken over $3 billion from the Kansas Highway Fund, and they're scheduled to take another $800 million over the next 2 years. And that could mean a more drastic increase in the amount of local funding. And how do we pay for that? Because the same document that I quoted before says that we could have a $9 billion shortfall in revenues to expenditures over the 20-year planning period. changes in the way we're talking about shopping and those kinds of things, that we're looking at a 45 to 60% increase in freight movement in this region. And it's mainly because people are buying with their phones online, having delivered. And these are the things that could impact us in terms of how we get that freight to your front door, what kind of impacts it has on the infrastructure in terms of costs and those kinds of things. But we're talking about several different questions that are related to quality of place. And the first of those is how to develop plans and strategies that meet the elements of quality of place for 3 or 4 new highly diverse generations that will face the region, be the face of the region over the next 20 years. How should the region prepare for trends showing losses in school-age populations, stabilizing population, and the substantial increases in over 65-year-old groups? Should we be looking at amending zoning ordinances and subdivision regulations to allow for mother-in-law type housing or student type housing on-site family members? With the probability of shrinking household size, are we still looking at the urban sprawl type of single-family housing, or should we concentrate more on infill developments? How do we reduce that $9 billion shortfall in infrastructure? That's just to preserve and maintain the infrastructure we have now. That's not counting any new projects that are taking place. And when you look at this in the quality of life, will the construction of new freeways and highways attract and maintain the younger generations? Should we be looking at a larger scale regional approach to funding sources? And perhaps the biggest question to be answered is, how do we present and market those changes that need to be addressed now for the good of the region, and how do we get past the built-in resistance to change? This isn't going to be just a sole effort on government's part or individuals' part. This has to be a community commitment in order to make the changes that we have to deal with in the future. It's going to take more than just remembering the good old days or remembering what it used to be like. It's going to have to be facing those future changes and having the courage to address them and to start that now.
Thank you. Phil, I'd like to make use of your expertise to drill down on a couple of data points that you mentioned, and maybe we can flesh out a few things. The projections are for very, very slow overall population growth. The projections are also for the aging of Wichita. Now, some of the data that I've looked at suggests that cities like Wichita, kind of regional urban centers, are collecting older populations from smaller, more rural areas. They're moving into the nearest large city because they need access to public transportation. They want to be closer to medical care resources or to family or so forth. So when you see these changes to Wichita that we have to think about in thinking about our quality of life, is it not also the sense that, to a degree, our quality of life and our changes in Wichita's quality of life are kind of inversely related to the quality of life of Pratt, Wellington, and other smaller towns in the area? What do you think about that?
I think this region is a microcosm of the state, and it's a microcosm of a lot of different areas of the country. We're seeing mass exodus to different parts of the country. You see Los Angeles in that area has just as many people as numerous number of states. And it's a matter of how do we attract and what do we find out about younger generations, and how do we make sure that we have the services, the facilities, the wants and needs that keep them here and to attract them. Because right now when we're talking about 11% drop in school-age population, and the main reason that we're seeing a kind of a stable population growth in the 18 or the 20 to 64-year-olds are because people are moving in from the rural parts of the state to take jobs at the aircraft areas. But we really need to start thinking about 4 different generations. We've had two generations over the past 70 years have planned our infrastructure, our policy decisions. I mean, it's a silent generation and the baby boom generation. And over the next 20-year period, you're going to have 3 more new generations or maturing generations that are going to be making policy decisions for this area and the state. So I think we really need to find out what they want, what it's going to take to keep them here, what type of infrastructure. And I'm not just talking about roads and bridges. I'm talking about walkability. I'm talking about hike and bike, those kinds of things that really make people want to stay here and to come here.
Okay, thank you. All right, well, Phil's presentation was a little sobering, so maybe Matt will bring something a bit more lighthearted. I mean, he is a man who went on a county-wide soda hunt recently. Yeah, that's true. So Matt Rill is a reporter for the Wichita Eagle, focuses on the arts and culture. He is the only member of this panel that did not send me a bio. And I'm going to use that opportunity to fill in something on my own. Matt doesn't know this, but he's about to find out. About 4 years ago, and this might have been one of his first jobs with the Wichita Eagle, he was assigned to write a nice puff story about the fishing clinic that takes place every June out at Great Plains Nature Center. And while he was there, he was looking around and he spotted a beautiful, brilliant, talkative, blonde-haired child who was fishing. And he came up to this child and he said, "Do you like fishing?" And this child proceeded to explain to him at great length her expertise at catching fish at the fishing clinic, giving him explanations of how you're going to get the trout to bite on your hook, and how you have to release the fish from the hook, and then you have to throw it back, but you can't throw it back too hard because then it might bounce on a rock. And he very dutifully included all of this in his story. I actually was a reporter in an earlier stage of my life, and I know that reporters want 2 things. One, they want to be able to really effectively capture the story. And 2, they hope that they can find someone who will enable them to capture all that by just giving them a whole lot of really good copy that they can write down. So my daughter Kristen gave you that copy, and we treasure that. But you didn't get the photographer to get a picture of Kristen. So, I mean, you got lines and lines of Kristen talking about the fishing clinic. You couldn't have gotten a photo? Ladies and gentlemen, Matt Riddle.
Well, first off, let me say I'm flattered to be asked to be here, sitting on a panel with 3 people that are much more experienced and wise than I am, as a just recently turned 26 years old. I don't have as much life experience or any of that sort of thing, but what I'm sort of hoping I can bring to the table here today is just sort of a candid discussion of what it's like to be a young professional in Wichita or somebody who's starting their career here. Because frankly, I think that it dovetails really well with what Phil was just saying about how I think talent retention is one of the key challenges that our area is facing, and quality of life and retaining young people, I think, go hand in hand, honestly. So, and it's been nice listening to everybody else's presentation too, and I'm sort of realizing the place of somewhat privilege that I speak from too, and especially in Renee's about, when I was thinking about this, I wasn't really thinking about, like people's like actual physical, medical health when it came to quality of place and how that pairs in. So it's been nice hearing all the, all the different perspectives on this topic. But as I said, I want to speak from the perspective of somebody who I grew up here in Wichita. Went to school all in here in the region, just across the highway at Newman University, and I graduated from there in 2015. And sort of, so I've witnessed this city grow a lot from, the 90s to now, and it's a totally different place now than it was even 5 years ago here in Wichita. All the efforts that people have done in the last few years. And so the question that people ask, and that this panel I think is sort of asking, is whether or not, Wichita has enough quality of place, or what can be done to improve the quality of place, here in town, or quality of life. And frankly, I agree with what Andrea was saying, and that I think we do have actually quite a bit of good amenities here in town to attract and entice people. But the problem is they're very scattered, and they sometimes operate in silos. Sometimes, you wouldn't necessarily know about everything that's going on here in town unless you decide to seek it out. If you're interested in theater, you've got to actually, join a Facebook group and, go search for things. And then you may not be in tune with the visual arts community, what they're doing, or, what the performing arts community is doing, or, what the makers community is doing. So I think that that's sort of an issue that we have in terms of quality of place, is that we're just very scattered and very, everyone sort of operates in their silos. As I said, you can't just walk downtown on a Friday night and just find things to do like you might be able to in somewhere like New Orleans, or, maybe even Denver. But yes, so to expand on that, I think that we do have, a lot of very talented people here. And, I think that's one of the top things Wichita has going for it, is we have very energetic, very creative types that will just go out and make the change in the community. I'm thinking about our artists and musicians. Just recently we had a project led by Armando Minarez, and he did a thing called the Horizontes Project. And I'm sure you've all seen the big grain elevator that was painted as sort of a reflection of the diversity in the neighborhoods, the North End and the Northeast neighborhoods in Wichita. And, we have people like that in town here who will actually go out and create that change, engage the people in the community, and set out to beautify the neighborhoods. So, and there's other things, the 17th Street mural project, Avenue Art Days in the Douglas Design District. All these things help to reduce blight. Elizabeth Stevenson's Open Studios project that fills vacant storefronts downtown that have been boarded up with artist studios, and it helps the people who own the buildings lease them out because people see them as enticing and full of life all of a sudden. So basically, here's what I sort of have to think about why we may have that sort of projected slow growth in people coming specifically to Wichita. It is that people my age are looking to live in cities that they perceive are actively growing, or at least not dying. And I'm not saying that Wichita is dying. Conversely, I think it's growing. But I think that what we need to start doing is, sort of as Phil said, we need to start targeting what's called Generation Z. And that's people that were born in 1996 and onward. Because, I'm technically a millennial, and most of us, we've already graduated from college, and if we haven't already chosen to start our careers in Wichita, it's the odds of coming back to do that are somewhat slim unless you already have a family connection or a school connection, any of that. But if you can get these people when they're still in college, entice these Gen Z people to stay here, then I think that that's where, we could maybe start to move the needle a bit. And it's sort of tough to poll, what the motivations or of a whole generation are, especially when, most of them aren't even done being born yet. But, from what I've seen, it's a very diverse and multicultural generation. And partially thanks to the democratization of voice that social media affords nowadays. And they're looking for work opportunities that are empowering and that offer advancement opportunities and somewhat flexibility. And that's, I think, honestly, number one. I think that's number one in Wichita, is to address the work climate. Because, you can live anywhere you want, But I mean, how are you going to stay there unless you have a job that, you know, finances you? Unless you're subsidized by your parents, which is another issue entirely. So we're not going to attract people to Wichita unless we provide them adequate jobs. And people nowadays are looking for these jobs that have, you know, potential for advancement, a degree of flexibility of remote work, you know, and aside from a few startups in town here, maybe some ad agencies, it's a little hard to find because a lot of Wichita's employers are your sort of very traditional legacy types. You know, they're either factory or, business, like Koch Industries or Cargill. You know, I think that we should really start to look at how we can perhaps loosen the rigor of the office curriculum, such as to maybe entice more people here, because if you know, I think sorry, let me back up a little bit. I think that jobs are number one on the priority of young people to town, and that dovetails into the quality of place, because if getting a job is step one. Step two is whether or not you actually want to live here, or whether you'll stay here for 2 years, put it on your resume, and move on to Kansas City. And I think that what people are looking for, as has been mentioned, is, a walkable downtown, just it's some access to public transportation, access to arts and entertainment, that sort of thing, and just affordable, well, not affordable, no, because it's not affordable. Healthcare options and such. I almost put affordable and healthcare in the same sentence. That's a bad idea. I think that, was that my time?
Well, you're close, but you can still go.
Okay, I will wrap it up then, because sometimes despite being a journalist, if I get talking, I sort of ramble a little bit, whereas in writing, I keep it succinct. So basically, what I'm trying to say is that I think that we can help attract young people here if we invest in our public spaces and, making sure that the quality of life here is good. That way, if the jobs come via, maybe the private sector or such, it's sort of a chicken and egg situation. They may want to come because the spaces are good here and people want to stay here, and people want to move to town because it's a place that they enjoy living and that is affordable. The cost of living is good here. So anyway, I'll wrap up my very long and winding presentation. So,
all right, thank you. Matt, I really like what you said about the impression that you have, and I think a lot of us have had similar impressions that there's a great deal of energy and talent and entrepreneurship and planning that's going on in Wichita, but that it is very scattered. It is very separated. I like that you used silos. And this is something that I encountered right after I moved to Wichita in 2006. I got to know through church a man named Dave Barber. Some of you might be familiar with him. He was a longtime city planner here in Wichita. And we were talking about the city, and he said, well, Wichita, despite not being a huge metropolitan area, is a city crowded with tribes. And they don't communicate with each other very well. So I would like to ask you, as a young person, as someone who grew up here and is building your career here, what are, in your view, the really relevant silos? When we moved here, everybody talked about, East Wichita, West Wichita. Is that, in your view, still a big deal, or are there other divides? Are there other silos that you think are more important that need to be wrestled with more urgently than some of these divides that maybe are decades and decades old?
Yeah, I mean, I would say I grew up with the same thing, East Wichita versus West Wichita. And, I'm an East Sider and I married a West Sider, so our parents give us lots of grief about that. But, but those of us, our age, we don't necessarily see that divide as much as being East versus West. I think one of the really growing, silos, as we call them, in Wichita are downtown dwellers nowadays. You're getting more and more people because the people who can afford to live downtown are people that are in fairly, lucrative jobs or military. And, like they're people who work at Coke and who work at Cargill and such. And, they're important decision makers. And so and then they start serving on boards and various, like park advisory and that sort of thing. So I think that they're starting to grow and influence, people in the immediate downtown area and surrounding, like in the Douglas Design Districts, more western, reaches, and College Hill included. I think that, that's sort of one of the reasons why I think we see a lot of downtown-centric planning going on right now is because, I'm not saying that they strictly, want to look out for themselves, but I think there's a belief that what is happening downtown will radiate outward, if we improve upon what's down there. So I think that's one silo. I think an important silo also to think about is people that aren't necessarily engaged in the civic process, or that people who don't really have an interest or a buy-in in downtown Wichita. Like, I'm thinking people who, maybe live, and I don't want to be very generalizing here, but, say somebody who lives down in Oak Lawn or something and, who works at Cessna and, they're just interested in, their family and their kids' schools and, isn't necessarily interested in the pop-up park downtown, and so I think that's an important group to think about. So you sort of have your downtown, the people who are invested civically, and I'm not saying, and I think that there are a group of people that sort of don't necessarily have that same level of buy-in, and that's why I look at a city like Oklahoma City, who in the same time period has seemingly done much more development than we have. They've built a whole canal district for themselves and everything, using generally 1 cent sales tax. And, that was at least 50% of their population bought into the idea of downtown development. And here in Wichita, I'm not entirely convinced that over 50% of the entire population of Wichita is entirely invested in downtown development just yet. There were some other issues with it, but a few years ago when we had our failed sales tax initiative, I think that we're still sort of, there's a divide right now between people who see the future of what Wichita could be, and they look at these other cities like Omaha and Oklahoma City and Kansas City, and then there are other people who just kind of want things to stay the same in the way that they have been since the 80s, 90s, and so on. So I think that there's sort of I think that's the main divide in Wichita right now.
I appreciate that analysis. All right, we have a half hour where I will take questions from the audience. And as I said before, please make them questions and direct them to particular members of the panel. I can jump in and redirect as I think is appropriate, but we'll see how things develop. And Malcolm, I saw your hand first, so go ahead.
I'm something that in my drink, I've lived here 13 years and moved here from some fairly small towns. One of the things that struck the student I met yesterday who moved here from Serbia, essentially, and another one from Britain, is the powerful networks Wichita has. Very different from the other places I've lived. And what creates those networks, or what is it about Wichita that makes that so marvelous? I give you examples, but I'm not supposed to make statements.
Anyone in particular, or just the panel in general?
We'll
So,
call on their
yeah.
collective wisdom.
What was the question again?
Why does Wichita have such great networks? I say that as someone who's lived in many other places, and this is very different.
Give us an example of the networks. Go ahead. Oh, that you're thinking about, just so help me understand what networks you're talking about. Okay, the TV stations or?
I live, no,
No, okay.
no.
Not the networks. What networks?
Quick example. I was exiled in Washington for 11 years. And I read a magazine called First Things. There's probably 10,000 readers in that metropolitan area. I met one person in 11 years. In 3 months here, I was in a First Things reading group. I could probably repeat that, if Russell here came here and said, gee, I have a student and he's kind of stuck with this project, he's trying to create this new thing. And I might say, well, so-and-so goes to my church, he used to work with this guy, call. That doesn't happen in New York City, where I grew up. It doesn't happen in Washington, D.C. It doesn't happen in Sydney, where I lived for 3 years. But it does happen here.
I appreciate that example, and I think that Andrea, you could speak to this, and maybe some of the others as well, because what he's talking about here is the surprising degree, in his view, and I would agree with him, of kind of local connectivity, of the ability of people, who maybe are not connecting across a broad space, but they're finding these little connections and they're building them up. What do you think about that?
This is just a bit of conjecture. Just looking at our history and what it took even just to be here and stay here, in this part of the country. The extremes in weather, what it was try to be a farmer to be here. I think that we're just kind of a sturdy stock, and I think that I do believe in this energetic spirit and this entrepreneurial spirit. And we look at the history and how Wichita was formed. We do a lot of manufacturing and making, and I think the thought of those. But I'm hearing from the panel members that this is a real inherent strength, but it is siloed a bit. And I think that has a lot to do is that we're in the second industrial revolution, and that's how it's been built. Our resources are siloed, our markets are siloed. But I do think that we're going into the third industrial revolution, and you have great, brilliant futurist thinkers like Jeremy Rifkin, who's already been working with China and Europe, laying down the infrastructure for the third industrial revolution, and it's all about connections. And I think Wichita has that, and I think just part of just being in the Midwest and not minding the extremes in weathers and politics, and I don't know if that answered your question, but I think it's just kind of the spirit of the people.
Renee?
I was just say we're Midwesterners. I mean, I really think when I've had people come visit here, I visit other places, they really talk a lot about you could walk in somewhere and you get a smile and you get a hello and you get that cordiality. And so we get to know each other in passing, in church, in community settings, and that getting to know each other then becomes, like you talked about, oh, I met a guy the other day that, has some link to this, and we don't have any sense of not just reaching out and calling that person and saying, hey, can you help me? And we link and we're helpful. And I just think that's just almost a cultural thing here in Wichita, that there's a helpful spirit. We want to be helpful and we want to be cordial, and that's how we kind of make connections. Now, how that actually, works and operates is different, but we always kind of have that connectivity with each other.
Did you want to say something, Matt?
Yeah, and
Just real quick.
Yeah, I'll just tack on to that too, that living here in Wichita, once you've been established here, is comfortable, and people stay here for a while. And so, you have the same families that, like the Carneys, the Pizza Hut family, a lot of them still live here in town. The Bells, And so you start developing these relationships with people who've lived here for, what was that? Sorry?
The Coke kids are here.
Yeah, the Cokes. Yeah, you know, you develop that relationship in the community, and just because people stay here for a while, I think that also adds on to how people can sort of make so many friendships and relationships with people in town who they may not even know.
You had a question, sir.
This is for Renee. You mentioned in regard to the Douglas Design District, there were no government funds obtained.
Right.
I couldn't tell if you were bragging or complaining.
I was bragging, honestly. I'm very proud, and we have been very proud of the fact that our initiative has, up until this last January, has been all volunteer led. We've been an all volunteer board whose everything that you kind of see and the progress you've seen in the district has been from business owners who've said, I want to make this a better place, and I'm going to volunteer my time and my money to make that happen. And so for me, that's pretty special about us, is that we've not done anything other than our own private investment.
You said up until this January.
Up until this January, and I say all volunteer board up until this January, and now we have one full-time staff person.
You.
Me.
Okay. Now, on a broader scale, rather than this Douglas Design, you said that there was an investing shortage. We were deficient in some areas.
Yeah.
Can you name the top deficiencies?
So this was from the Chung report, and I'll kind of just pull, I should have written a little bit more, but when James Chung came into town, his last presentation in 2018, he did some comparative with, I think, Omaha, Oklahoma City, Des Moines, maybe Fayetteville, a couple of other comparable Midwestern cities, and looked at like civic investment, looked at community philanthropic investment, and specifically he was comparing community foundation assets, so our community foundation compared to other community foundations, downtown residential and commercial and mega projects. Some of the kind of big, the baseball stadium would be considered a mega project, and was kind of just comparing how much other cities have invested in those sorts of categories. And Wichita fell short, significantly short, in every single one. And I can direct you to where those numbers are. I didn't write those numbers down, but it was just it was eye-opening to me, because you look around and you think like there's all this stuff happening in development, and of course these are older numbers too, but it was stark in comparison to other places.
Jacob.
Like when we're talking about culture and these things, the term gentrification always comes up, especially when we're talking about local businesses. And I always think of like the outrage, although it was short, when like Regal bought out Warren and those type of things. So how do we prevent chains from buying out our local businesses, especially on like a Warren level, like a business that the Wichita public will use? Because like we can talk about how great Coke is, but Wichita public doesn't directly buy stuff from Coke that often like it does from Warren or from different restaurants. So how do we prevent those chains from buying out those local businesses, and should we, considering that entrepreneurs and local businesses have a much more difficult time succeeding when competing with massive chains that are already established?
Was that specifically for Renee or others? Or
To anyone
who wants to take a stab at that?
Well, I think one trend, and still in the future, is the localization process. And there are moves to establish local stock markets, local investment, and really investing in local entrepreneurs. Because in the scheme of things, that's where the economy is. When you add nonprofits and activity that happens even outside of the paid economy, 80% of our economy is local. But our investment interests, investments and whatnot go to Wall Street. So it's this Wall Street versus Main Street. So we really need to start figuring out how we can adjust so that we really do start investing in our local entrepreneurs, because that's where it all starts anyway. And so I say really looking at that, and that's why WASDE looks at creating a food economy, because it is the one way to start localizing an economy. And it's also a way to connect people and to create these, breaking down the silos. But I would say localization is key.
Matt?
I'll also tag on. When I hear your question, the first thing that pops to mind is Mead's Corner in downtown, closed to be torn down for office building, and now news the Starbucks is going to be opening at Douglas and Topeka. And I think that it's something that really we do need to think about. People debate a lot about whether or not is gentrification always bad, or is sometimes are we improving an area? But to your point, another thing I think of is that because they may not be able to be downtown anymore because the rents are too much, or chains are buying them out. I think that in that case, they need to, people should start looking at other areas of town that they can start colonizing and make cool. Like, for example, I think of Revolution over at Central and Volusia here in town, the shipping container mall. That's all local businesses now, and I think will it continue to be that way? I mean, I hope. I'm not entirely sure, but I think that one of the keys is just being able to be a good small business owner and to be able to adapt to these challenges. And I know that real estate, like in the location, is key, but I think if they're able to sort of figure out where else they could go to create that same sort of vibe, that might help a little bit. I mean, I don't know if that really answers it totally, but yeah.
Okay. Right here? Yes.
How do we as small business owners, I'm a small business owner, I'm a speech therapy clinic, how do I get information out there of possible angel investors into my clinic or into another small business? How do we get the information in the community about possible investors into small businesses? I've been doing this on my own for 3.5 years, so I have no idea what area I would even research if I were to try to find an investor into the clinic.
Sure. I mean, I think that Wichita is getting a little bit better, and there are some definitely up and coming networking groups and different things that are happening. I don't know if you've heard of 1 Million Cups or E2E Accelerator and some of the, let's talk afterwards then, because there are, I mean, that's always, it's kind of been a long-term problem of, angel investment and those sorts of things being in Wichita and creating that here. But you're absolutely right. There's an entrepreneurial spirit here. There are people that actively are creating startups and are creating businesses and need support. And there is a movement right now, definitely in a number of different pockets of places that are trying to help make those connections and really make those investments happen. So I would definitely be happy to talk to you more about what some of those look like.
Sir, you had your hand up earlier.
Yeah, Phil, I got a question for you.
Good. Somebody needs to ask Phil a question.
You've got a lot of experience, has moved a lot, so this is really germane to it. Insofar as the quality of life, I feel that's just a philosophy to allow governments to expend funds in non-governmental activities for whatever purposes. And that leads to the fact that the bigger the government is, the more it takes income from the people, and so you have less disposable income. So are people moving outward migration because they're increasing their disposable income, like down to Texas or down to Florida? Is that why you think people move from city to city, is to increase their disposable income? Because government's getting too big where they're at, or too expensive to afford?
I don't know that government is big here in Wichita, Sedgwick County. I think government everywhere has done a really poor job of telling people what they get for their investment. It's like every place I speak, I say, how many of you paid $1 a day for police protection? And almost every hand in the room goes up. Well, in the city of Wichita, it's 57 cents per person per day for police protection. People just don't understand what they get for their investment because government has not done a good job of telling them that. As far as moving to different places, it probably is a lot for different higher paying jobs and those kinds of things, but there has to be planning for the future, and it has to be planning for, in terms of, what do you get for your investment? And again, government has done a really poor job of telling people what they get for their investment. And every budget that I ever did had a section in it, and I did probably 42 budgets over my career as a city and county manager. Had a section in it of what you pay for and what you get. And I can't really tell you why people move out of community other than the fact of, I got a better job opportunity, my family there's a better educational experience someplace. If you don't like paying taxes, you don't like paying taxes. It's just one of those things, but you have to consider what you get back in return for the investment you make in your community. And I don't know that any number of cities invest that much in non-governmental services. And if they do, it's because there are certain segments of the population that want something, and it's more than just, it's not a one-size-fits-all outlook for government. It really isn't. You have to take into consideration the entire community.
We have a question in back.
I have a question for Phil as well. We talked about the issue of jobs. You know, it seems like that is a big deal, right? I wasn't too long ago I graduated from college, and what's the first thing I do when I graduate from college? I need a job. And if I go work at McDonald's or any retail store or anything like that, I'm gonna have to live at home because I obviously can't get paid enough to do it. So most people that are young, they just go where the job is, right? That's just exactly what you do. And you know, with the issue of automation, Boeing's going to need less and less people. Aircraft's going to need less and less thumbs all the time as things get automated. We're automating everything. We're automating secretaries. You know, you can whatever. So it seems like all people are having this problem. Farmers are having it, so then people move to Wichita. You know, you don't need as many farmers as you did. People leave to Wichita. People are congregating to the big cities because that's where all the jobs are. Google will spend $100,000 to acquire someone who's talented, to acquire more than I'm going to make in 3 years, you know, all in acquiring the person. And I don't have a great solution, so I'm going to ask how the city is trying to, deal with this problem of, the job market changing so much, and all the young people going, I need a job and I need to make $40,000 a year. What am I going to do? And maybe there is nothing the city can do, but
I wish you'd been here last time so you could ask our city manager. Yeah. We had Bob Layton here. We could have put him on the spot. Bob, employ this man. But Phil, you cannot separate the question that he's asking from the planning that you're talking about. So
no, I think that's one of the things that this area, this region needs to concentrate on is are the job markets going to be? Every week I watch This Old House, and they talk about 6 to 8 million vacant jobs in professional contracting jobs, those kinds of things. They're not preaching that everybody doesn't need a college education, but they're saying that there are different types of things that come up, and you need people to maintain the robots that are building these different things that are coming up. And it's a matter of training and retraining and reinvesting in the community in order to bring the jobs in that are germane to people. And it's not just the jobs, it's people having to have the ability to say, I did that for 25 years, I'm gonna have to retrain to do something else. And there are thousands of open jobs in Wichita right now, but there's a lot of different things that people can't get to them because they don't have transit, they don't have access to vehicles. 6% of the households in Wichita don't have access to a car. And the transit system tries desperately, but the city's spread out so much that the transit system can't remain, or it's not viable because the headways are hour to an hour and a half to get to where you want to go. If you work first shift, you can get home, you get to work and get home. If you work second shift, you can get to work, but you can't get home. If you work third shift, you can't get to work or home. So these are the kinds of things that we need to make sure that things change to where there's access and mobility to get people where they need to go and how they need to get there. But 54% of household income right now goes towards transportation and housing expenses. So these are the kinds of things that we need to make sure are changing to make sure that people get to where they need to go when they need to get there.
You want to pick up the question?
Well, dovetail. Another question on that, and ask you too, is it seems like my generation equated mobility and accessibility as the same term. But it seems like, particularly with the younger generations that I've seen visit multiple cities, they see accessibility and mobility as different. As in, seems like most of the younger generations, if you transplant them to Wichita, they're not interested in going all over the place in Wichita. Wherever they're at, they want everything there. And the way I define the difference between mobility and accessibility is that if you're highly mobile, you can go 100 miles in Montana very quickly and you're still nowhere. New York City, you can walk 2 blocks.
Is that an insult?
Well, it's highly
Montana's a nice
low
place.
accessibility. Where New York City, you walk 2 blocks, you've only made it a quarter mile, but you pass the doctors, you pass the supermarket, you pass the restaurant. So is that an accurate reflection of the trends in the younger generations? And if so, how do you make Wichita more accessible?
Yeah, that's something that I was just talking about today is, we were talking about what it looks like to walk from Old Town to Delano, which is something that I think very few people in Wichita would really do. And if you were to transplant yourself to Chicago, walking that same distance is like nothing, just like you said. And I think it's just because there's so few things to do, there's office buildings on Douglas and such, and there's occasional small businesses here and there, but it feels like more of a task. And I know it's sort of your question talks about accessibility versus mobility, and I think there has been a paradigm shift over the years, whereas in the past I think people associated accessibility with what can I get to with my car, and nowadays I think that the younger generation thinks a little bit less about, what can I drive to? Can I drive to Bradley Fair from my downtown apartment and go to Trader Joe's? Or, what can I walk to? What can I bike to? What's the quickest possible thing I can do and get it done? Because I think a lot of young people really value their time, and it's just whatever's closest at hand right there. So I say that just to sort of validate that I think that you are spot on, actually, with your assessment of with what people like in this current generation are wanting.
I'm going to exercise my prerogative. We're running out of time for questions, and I'd like to note what seems to be, at least to my mind, a common theme that we can discern here. I appreciate your comments about accessibility and mobility. We have seen through all of the presentations a consideration of localism, a consideration of the fact that there really is a lot of artistic and entrepreneurial activity taking place, but also in the sense that maybe that entrepreneurial activity, that artistic activity is siloed and separated. And so there are questions about getting people to where there are the customers, where there are the buyers, where there are their investors, and so forth. There's a couple of questions that I know people are looking to ask. I would just, invite you all to contemplate that issue in connection with the idea of quality of life. The quality of life is both micro and macro, and we have got to find a way to bring some of those things together. Okay, a couple more questions. Yes, go right ahead.
For the piano, the per capita taxes in Texas is $3,000 per person for the state taxes. In Kansas, it's $6,000 per person. To put my child in private school at CSW, I pay $6,000 a year. The average expenditure per child in the state of Kansas is $14,000 per child, a little over $14,000 per child. So, and it's increased every year, except for during the recession, only the amount spent on schools in Kansas, except, and yet the test scores are flat. They haven't increased at all. So I guess the question is, how do you build new businesses? How do you get more, how do you spend more money on arts, entertainment, things like that, and build these things? Does the money just come out of thin air? You know, I mean, if the taxes are too high and you're spending them on the wrong things and spending the wrong way. I mean, I have an educational services company, and I know that the way we're running our education system is not the best way. You know, I mean, look at all the research we're totally ignoring. And they don't want to hear it. All they want to hear is spend more money. How can we increase the amount of jobs that we have and increase the amount of spending we have on things for our lifestyle if taxes keep increasing?
In the first place, Texas has a lot more people to pay the cost of providing services than Kansas does. They also have different revenue sources that come in through ports, through oil, through all those different kinds of things that they generate. The biggest thing that I can think of is that, and this is my personal opinion, that we need to try something different in terms of, we have 300 school districts in this state. They went through a big consolidation once before. Perhaps it's time to do something like that. I was doing some research the other day, and there were a couple of counties in southwest Kansas that had one birth the whole year. These are the kinds of things that I think need to be looked at to consolidate services to offer something different and something new. It's time for change, and people don't want to change. That's just as simple as it is.
I'd like to point out real quick that this investment, this localization, investing in entrepreneurs, because our local entrepreneurs are the ones that create the jobs. That is the trend. And there is this trend that the corporate structure, I mean, people are starting to become the economy. Go to an Airbnb, go to Uber, get a Lyft, call someone who's going to come over and fix your computer for you. So we need to really start and use human capital, right? Invest in our human capital and find out ways to do that and localize. I think that doesn't really help with the tax issue per se, but it'll take maybe more pressure off our corporations, and we'll just start doing it ourselves.
I think we got time for one more question, and so of course I will let Jane do that.
I'm going to present a situation that I'd like your comments on, so it's going to sound like a statement. In the past,
But it is a question.
It will.
It will be a question.
In the past year and a half, on my block, city block, in the Douglas Design District, there have been 4 folks moving incoming from Southern California, and they don't, well, 2 are brothers, but the rest don't know each other. They're coming in. Do you see such a trend? They're coming in. One's retiring to our childbearing. In fact, there are going to be 2 births on my block this July. Diverse neighborhood.
You know a lot about your neighbors. Keeping track of these things.
She does.
Networking, yes.
But they didn't know, they didn't buy in because they knew me.
Mm-hmm. Right.
Well,
Okay.
I was going to say, I mean, I think Wichita does have a boomerang trend. So what you're describing sounds like they're either coming back, or they're coming here because they're wanting to start a family.
One family who already has 3 kids researched another place to live from Southern California. The fellow visited Wichita, heard about it, visited Wichita a couple of times, and then bought a house. And then they drove in.
Yeah, I think
There's influx as well as outgo. Maybe that's not its statistical level, but I just have one block.
right. No, I mean, I think people do come back to Wichita to raise families again.
They're
Whether
not coming back.
well, I come to Wichita to raise families. I think that cost of living.
Retirees.
I think, well, even that, I think cost of living here is definitely affordability. And then either coming to retire or coming to raise a family. I think that there's definitely a strong differentiation between the young professionals and the millennials that are moving out or not coming in. And those people that, I mean, Wichita is, it's quiet, it's comfortable, the cost of living, if you're retiring or you don't necessarily, if you're making a well enough living, Wichita is very lucrative and attractive to people. I don't think it is, I mean, I think that there's definitely a level of that happens and actually happens quite often, but unfortunately it's not offsetting what we're seeing out migrate and what we're not having come in. So that's just my personal experience. I as a young mother with a family, there's families moving here all the time because it's a very family-friendly city. But it's not offsetting what we know to be true about young professionals. That's just my.
Matt?
Yeah, and I'll say too that I've read statistics about specifically Southern California. There's a particular exodus of people from that area because it's just so expensive to live there, and a lot of them are moving to Nevada. But I also saw a study that a lot of them are moving to Des Moines, and I will say Des Moines is a very cool city. Yeah. It's very fun. But so I think that sort of plays into it too. Like I think as people's jobs are sort of changing, I know of people who have remote positions now, and this lady, she works from her RV and she travels the country, and she makes a pretty decent salary doing that. I think that as these jobs continue to grow and become more flexible, that affords people who might have their companies based in Southern California or wherever else to move wherever they want, and I think they want to maximize the money, and in Wichita you certainly can maximize your paycheck based on what you're paying for rent or your mortgage. And so, I mean, it doesn't surprise me to hear that. I mean, that's really cool to hear. But yeah, I think that Wichita does give you a lot of bang for your buck. And I think that's why a lot of people, if they have that option of returning or just coming here for some purpose, that would be one reason to come here.
So it's money what they feel is well spent, but they like it. They like Wichita.
Yeah.
They like Wichita.
There's a lot more that we could say about this. There's a lot more that we could dig out of these presentations or share amongst ourselves, but we are out of time. Let's give another round of applause to our panelists.